Hi, everybody. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty A. Wilson. And Patty, she seems to think that I'm going to enjoy tonight's episode. So we'll see, but I bet I will because I like anything that you do.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I think this is going to be particularly interesting because I know you're fascinated with the topic of dimensions.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was doing some reading on, the world and the dimensions, and we come from a three-dimensional world, but there are other dimensions. And, despite the fact that Einstein had come up with this theory that argued that there were no other dimensions, it's since been proven not true. And scientists of today believe that there might be multiple dimensions. That's where they get the concept of a multiverse, and that these dimensions are literally like balloons inside of balloons inside of balloons. That was the best, simplest explanation I saw. So that the only thing separating them is energy, not, distance and space the way we think of it in our physical world. And all of this started because I'm fascinated with the idea of frequencies and how frequencies can change our physical health. They can change our spiritual health. They can change, so much. Everything on our planet vibrates at a specific frequency. And likewise, the argument is made that on every other dimension, there will be a different vibration, but yet it will do basically what we do here. And not only do we see the idea of people being on other dimensions, which is where they come with the idea of things like parallel realities or parallel dimensions. And so I started going down that rabbit hole. And as you know, when I get started, I have a hard time getting out of them.
And you jump in with both feet.
Yeah. I do. I spend days on it sometimes. So the idea that there are parallel dimensions actually kind of came into being, believe it or not, as early as Plato. He argued that there were other dimensions and beings who transmuted from those dimensions to ours as visitors or gods.
So the concept of that, I mean, so like, in and of itself, that would have been in Plato's time. And if I remember correctly now, 350 BC, was that about his time?
Yes, about his time.
Okay. A concept like that would have been so off the wall, so unheard of. That makes me think that, okay, he was given that information. He had direct experience. Yeah. And that's where he got the idea. So so it wasn't an original idea. He was given it to maybe by interdimensional travelers. But anyway, that's
possibly. Yeah. He wasn't the only Greek philosopher to hold that idea, but that might be because there were beings coming and going, and they were trying to figure out a way to explain it. He doesn't talk about it in that way, but he does say that he does mention that he witnessed such events, and so you're very much accurate in that. And it was played off as just by historians and scientists throughout history from that point forward as just an idea, and it was never given any great credence until there was a gentleman from Princeton University. He was a graduate student by the name of Hugh Everett. In 1954, he came up with a mathematical probability that proved he felt that there were other dimensions, not other planets necessarily, but dimensions. I'm not saying planets don't exist, but that these dimensions actually existed, and that we are being visited, maybe not so much by Martians, but from dimensional creatures that come from elsewhere. And they slide through on frequency variations, and they either are able to attune themselves to different planets, different dimensional frequencies, if you will, or they are able to build a suit or something that's able to help them to withstand the changes in frequency. Because, as you know, every every planet, every dimension vibrates at a specific hertz, and that hertz is what everything on that particular dimension vibrates with. So for us, the Earth vibrates at a specific hertz, and what holds us all together, the gravitational thing that holds us all together, our molecules, our atoms, is that vibration. My desk has it, my laptop has it, I have it, the trees have it, the grass has it. The whole planet functions that way. And he came up with the idea and the mathematical possibility that there are other dimensions out there that basically function exactly the same way, just at a slightly different frequency. And then along comes a gentleman by the name of Bryce DeWitt, who actually glums on to Hugh Everett's theory, and he names it the many worlds interpretation. And so we know it probably better as the multiverse. So there are multiple universes of dimensions inside of each other, going back to that theme of looking at it like a balloon inside of a balloon inside of a balloon. And each of them are distinct and separate balloons, but they're able to touch in some way on the other balloons, making a connection, a dimensional connection, if you will. That's the easiest one I saw to explain it in general terms. There have been arguments for a long time that perhaps ghosts are really not the spirits of the dead, but interdimensional beings, or that they are maybe people from our dimension who change their frequency when they die and move on and are able to come back. Speaking more directly about the ones who are cognizant, that, we talk about this doorway of death, that perhaps that's not really what it is. It's that we actually, when the physical body falls away, that needs to be held together, we change frequency, and now we enter a new dimension. There's some arguments that have been made that deja vu is actually the concept of you having, that you're a spirit that is eternal, and that you change dimensions as you go through this process, and that those deja vu moments are actually you remembering things that you saw as a previous being. And it is a theory that has been expounded for quite a long time. And the other one that goes into this are dreams. That dreams may actually be where we slightly alter the vibration so that we're able to communicate interdimensionally through those dreams, because our whole body is more calm, we've shifted our focus, and that these things are able to contact us that way. So I was fascinated by all of this stuff, but I actually have another goal in mind, and we're going to get there here in just a moment. But we know now that scientists are telling us there are at least 4 dimensions. There are other scientists telling us there are multitudes of them, that they just simply have no way of knowing what they are. And that, they believe that there is the ability to transport from one to another. And one of the things that was fascinating when I was reading through all of this is that if there are ultimately more dimensions, one of the things that we have in our planet that is a puzzle to our scientists is why we only use a small portion of our gravitational pull. What makes us different? It's not like there are planets that have very, very strong gravitational pull, and they can't tell us why our planet has the gravitational pull it has. They can't tell us why other places would have a different one. They have not been able to figure out that dimension of what that means. They only know that it's working, and they're trying to still piece all those pieces together. And then as I was going through all of this, a friend of mine sent me some declassified documents from the FBI through the Freedom of Information Act that they had been going through. And this is where I began to go down the rabbit hole that I personally like the best, because I'm that girl,
Okay.
So in this declassified document from, I believe it was 1974, the FBI admits that there are alien beings visiting us, but they're not from other planets. They're from other dimensions.
And that's not the first time I've heard that before. People like Bob Lazar, for example, would say that the aliens that he saw and worked with were interdimensional beings. Oh, and the goodness, the radio talk host
Art Bell.
Art Bell, yes, he had callers that said that they were interdimensional beings.
Yes, some of these documents go all the way back to 1947, the FBI documents. There's one that I thought was really interesting. It said they're talking about having known that this was a national security issue at the beginning, that they had looked into it for that reason. They've been studying it for a long time, and then they wrote, some of these beings originate from an ethereal plane coexistent with our physical universe. These entities could materialize on our planet and appear as giant translucent figures.
Translucent. Interesting.
So I began to do a little research on translucent figures. Like, okay, so are we seeing them very often? And it actually gave me a different perspective on an event that I've talked to you about before in my family, and I'll get to that in due time. So I began to go through, just rummaging through, looking for translucent being stories. Are there many of them? We all know the usual UFO stories, small grays, the tall grays, the reptilians, yada, yada. This doesn't touch on them in particular. So there may be multitudes of them coming in multitudes of ways. We're going to focus on the translucent ones today. So I found this really interesting. These are all eyewitness accounts. Gentleman said that he was in Puerto Rico when he was 20 years old. He had this visitation, if you will, with an alien. He said that he was in his home, and he said he looked over and there was this creature, and he described it as translucent. And he said one of the things that he found bizarre about it as he stood there and like studying it was that it had its hands backwards. So the left hand and the right hand seemed to be switched so that the pinky and the thumb were in the wrong places. And he noticed that. He said it walked with great difficulty. And when I could see its feet, they were like his hands, twisted and in the wrong place. So the little toe was on the inside and the big toe was on the outside of the foot. As the being was there, which would also probably explain part of its difficulty in walking, because it's a balance issue. With our gravitational pull, that would be a balance issue if he was trying to, manipulate and navigate in our planet. He said the skin is translucent. It looked really weak. I wasn't scared. I felt calm. This is important because this one is very different than some of the others we're going to encounter. He said that it started to talk to him, and he said its lips never moved. He knew it was talking in his mind, and it asked him to go to a particular observatory in Puerto Rico, which is one of the largest in the world. And he said he was trying to argue with it that it was something he couldn't do. Like, you just can't go stop over and visit an observatory any old time you please. There's rules. And this thing got upset, if you will, and he said, I saw a flash of blue light, and then I blacked out. When I woke up, I was on the balcony of my home, and it was hours later. He estimates that he probably lost 2 to 3 hours time. And he said he can't explain what happened, and it has always bothered him. But he has no doubt whatsoever that he saw this very bizarre creature.
Just all kinds of thoughts going through my head on that one, and they're just a jumble right now, especially since, right, so not necessarily a mirror image, because as we actually we can articulate our hands and our wrists and everything else, and we can rotate them around and things like that. So maybe they could also rotate. How do you rotate a foot around, though? That would be a little more interesting.
Either that, or they were trying to mimic us and they just didn't get it exactly right.
They didn't get it right. Yeah, that's another thing. But very curious. But he didn't feel threatened. But then, of course, he experienced that loss of time. That's a common theme through a lot of encounters with EBEs, extraterrestrial biological entities.
Yep.
Yeah.
But and again, I found a whole bunch of different types, and there'll be one that will emerge from it as the primary one that they seems to happen. So this second story came from a gentleman who was a police officer in New York City. So he was a trained observer, and he said he woke up early one morning, and he heard what he thought was a twig breaking. That was that snap sound, and he turned toward the sound trying to locate what it was in his house, and he saw a translucent being walking. He said he struggled with the sense of what he was seeing, and whatever this thing was right outside his window. It walked into a bush and simply faded away.
You know, now I got to think back, because I told you a story at one point that I thought it was a shadow figure I saw right outside this window. I don't know if you can see where I'm pointing to right there. And it was on a Saturday morning, very sunlit.
Yes.
And I saw what looked like, now I said it kind of had, yeah, and again, it's from, I don't know if the stories you're telling me, there are people that are in a low light situation, or whether it's a highlight, or a sunlight kind of daylight situation. But yeah, this had not necessarily like a clear delineation. It was kind of fuzzy around the edges, but I could definitely see through it. And it's like it just walked, and it didn't pay me any never mind, and just walked into my front stoop, and then it was gone.
Yeah, I remember that story.
Huh?
And I think that you didn't have any feeling of fear, though. You were just curious, correct?
No, I was extraordinarily curious. I was looking at it, and then, in the aftermath of it, I was just, evidently my wife thought I was rather shaken, because whenever I went upstairs to where she was sitting in the living room, and she was like, "What happened?" Because she could just tell by looking at me that something extraordinary happened. And so I tried to describe it. Even before that, though, I opened the front door to look and see if I could see, because it was, right at the front door. So, and I couldn't see anything. But yeah, again, that's just strange,
It is. So next story I wanted to tell you, this one, it'll have both highlight and low light situations, because it's going to be a series of events over about a 24-hour period. So this gentleman was in a national forest in Louisiana. He and his cousin were out hunting, deer hunting, so late fall. And he's like, he was in his 30s when this began. So him and his cousin are going to a place that they go to every year to go deer hunting. This has been a family tradition. They have done this over and over again. He grew up hunting, and this was one of the places his old man had taken him previously. And now he's, in his 30s, and him and his cousin, who are best friends, go out hunting. As they're walking in this trail to where they want to set up their hunting camp for the weekend, his cousin says to him, as they slow down to take a break, "Aren't you concerned about who's following us?" And he looks around and he's like, "There's nobody following us." He's like, "Couldn't you hear that walking? There's somebody following us." And the guy's like, "No, I don't hear anything." So and he actually thinks that at first it's a joke, that his cousin's maybe like jerking his chain, trying to like scare him like when they were kids, that kind of a thing.
Right.
And the cousin's insistent that it's true. There was something there. And he's like, "I don't know what the heck it was. It was just this weird see-through thing. Like you could just catch motion moving, but not actually see the person." And he heard it. He said he heard it walking, but the other guy didn't. So they decide to set their camp up, and they start getting their stuff, out of their backpacks and getting their tents put up and what have you. And the cousin's still like, "I can hear it from time to time. Don't you hear anything?" And he's like, "Stop it. We're not kids. Quit it." He's like, I'm not joking, man." And so the cousin kind of quiets down about it, and they get their camp set up. And the gentleman says that throughout the afternoon and the evening, he kept catching like a glimpse of something moving in the corner of his eye. But he also kept thinking, maybe I'm just imagining it, because he kind of put that in my head. And then, as it got later at night and they have the campfire and what have you, he started to notice the motion around the trees, something moving among the trees and something flickering around out there and flitting along. But he couldn't make it out, whatever was going on. So he said he got kind of antsy, because you could almost feel like there was somebody watching you. and yet you couldn't quite see what was there, but you would catch motion and then you'd look directly at it and it wouldn't be there anymore. So he ended up sleeping that night with his pistol under his pillow because he was pretty rattled and pretty scared. So the next morning they get up and they don't seem to have any problems, and they get breakfast and what have you, and they start out to go to this, go deer hunting. And he said that's when his life changed forever. That was his exact words. He says that he's, they're sitting there eating at lunchtime out in the woods, and he's looking at his cousin, and his cousin's like staring off in the distance, and he's intent and terrified looking. Is what's going on? What are you looking at? And the guy points to a clearing about 60 feet up ahead of him, and there it was. He said it was like that instinct you have to run, as though you're in mortal terror of something. He just had this horrible fear. And he said, whatever it was about 12 foot up in a tree. It was human looking, but completely see-through. And it was crouched down on a tree branch, watching him, watching them both. And it was frozen as if it was watching them, watching it. And it knew that they had seen it. And he said the fear that just welled up inside of him was so intense. And he said to his cousin, we're getting the hell out of here right now. And they just grabbed what they could in their, from their backpack that was there handy, shoved it in the backpack. It took him less than 60 seconds. And he said, this thing moved. It stood up and it hopped off the limb of the tree. And he could hear it thump onto the ground. And it was about 5 foot tall from his estimation. And it started to move. And it moved fast and fluid like an animal moving, slinky. And it was moving so fast, but he could still see it because it was like a shape. At one point, it's been described multiple times, like water running, like a cellophane moving, or like heat waves in the shape of a person. These are the ways it's been described. And whatever it was, it took off and it was moving so fast. It covered 10, 15 yards in a second or two and was behind a bush, and it stopped. He could hear the bush ruffle as though something was in it. And then he said they just bolted and started going. Now they were a good almost 2-hour walk away from the car. So he knew whatever this thing was fast enough it could catch him. And it played tag with them all the way back to the car. It would be there right behind him, almost like it could touch him, and then it would stop and let him get 50, 60, 100 yards in front of it. And then it would just zip, and it would be right there. They would look, and sometimes it would be in front of them, standing there waiting for them, like it was a cat and a mouse game. And they just kept moving. There was nothing else they could do. Finally, they get to the truck. They threw their stuff into the back and just jumped into the truck. And as they're going out of there on this old dirt road, they see it on at least a couple occasions. It's standing along the road as though it had run ahead of them and was watching them just to creep them out. They finally get off of that road and they go home. He said he didn't tell anybody for a couple of days. His wife knew there something was really wrong, and he was so rattled. And finally he told her what he had seen, and he's like, you can't tell anybody. It's insane. I know that. And it was something he couldn't quite in his head make himself accept or understand. And he just kept it silent. He never talked to his cousin about it. They never brought it up to each other. You'll hear that sometimes in UFO cases where, like, there's like the Allagash 4 where 4 men are kidnapped by a UFO, and none of them ever talk about it until one of them begins to have serious nightmares. These 2 guys aren't talking about this. Months go by, and it's the holidays. He's at a relative's house, and they're having Christmas, and he's sitting in the one living room all by himself, and his dad comes in. Dad sits there, and they start talking a little bit, and his dad finally says, so I hear you ran into the phantom out in the woods. And this guy looked at his dad, and he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, your wife told me about what happened out there in deer season. She's a little worried about you. She doesn't think you're the same. Like something happened to you and it's really messed you up. And he said, why do you call it a phantom? He asked his dad. He said, well, you see, a lot of people have seen it out there. It's not just you. And I've seen it. I was seeing it when I was 17. I was out coon hunting with a buddy of mine. And he tells them a story about how they were out there with the dogs and they were having a great time. It was late fall, kind of a nice night, you know. And that's when they saw, and this is where the Reynolds wrap comes in. And his father described it as looks like stacks of Reynolds wrap, clear and clean, that plastic stuff in the shape of a man moving along the shoreline across the river from where they were hunting. And that's when he saw the figure was between 5 and 6 foot tall, and it was like distorted at its edges, but it was completely clear other than that distortion. And the dogs went nuts. They were acting strange, whimpering and wanting to get away. So after they saw this thing, they turned around. They were trying to get the dogs under control, and the thing just stepped into the water and went under the water and was gone, just gone. And he's like, he wouldn't have, he's like, I don't think I've ever told anybody if my dad hadn't told me that story.
It's almost like that now. Well, my understanding of other dimensions would be that we actually occupy the same space.
Right.
And so we're just a little bit askew from one another. And that's where we don't perceive the others usually, unless there's some circumstances that happen. And whether the circumstances are natural or whether they've been manipulated by some force, some entity that has the ability to do that. I mean, that would certainly indicate some type of really advanced, both mathematics and science, for that to happen. At least in my in my primitive mind.
Right.
So I guess we think of things that are being very intelligent to be methodical and logical. But this sounds just mischievous. Or
I don't know.
This phantom, it doesn't sound like it's ever caused harm, physical harm, but it certainly sounds like it causes mental anguish. Like, I'm going to mess with you. I'm going to make you remember me, and you're going to have this memory for a long, long time.
Right. And I will say that the people that are seeing it, that are telling the stories, are telling it that way. They're almost every one of the stories of this particular type of entity come with things like intense fear, this cat and mouse kind of feeling. There are lots of them. And but I wonder if there's something more sinister at foot. And I'll tell you one more story, and then I'll go on to explain what I'm talking about. Okay. So there's this other story about a woman who, when she was 5 years old, she was like in her grandma's yard, and she was playing, and she saw what she described as, as this entity. Again, same thing. She's, outside playing. It's middle of the fall. She sees this invisible man, is what she calls him. Like, she could just see the faded at the edges kind of thing, that warped thing. And it scared her to, she's like, I knew in that, even though I was only 5, I knew that I shouldn't be seeing what I was seeing. It scared her to death, and she broke, and she took off running, got into the house. She tried to tell her grandma what she saw, and her grandma told her it was an angel. It's all good. So fast forward a lifetime, and she remembered that whatever this thing was, it clicked. It made a clicking sound, like a sound. So fast forward, she's now in her 30s. She's living in a different town. She has just rented this apartment. It sort of sits at the edge of a bunch of woods, this apartment building, and she smokes. So she goes out one night to smoke a cigarette, because she doesn't smoke in the house where her children are, and she hears this clicking sound, and immediately it takes her back to her childhood, and she's absolutely terrified. And she starts looking, and she said her first thought wasn't that it had to be this thing again, because she thought, was there an animal that makes that clicking sound too? But she's watching, and then she sees it moving, and it starts moving in the trees. It's right up in the tree, and it's looking down at her, the tree left of her house, of her apartment. And she's looking up at it, and it's watching her. It's all crouched down on a branch with one hand holding on to another branch, like balancing itself. And she said, all of a sudden, I got this feeling it's come to kill me because I should not have seen it all those years ago. She bolts in for the house. The neighbor's dog starts yelping and screaming. She locks the doors and the windows, and she sits there in absolute fear. And what she would describe it as looking like is the Predator thing from the movie The Predator. Not the tentacles, but that general just warping of space.
Mm-hmm.
There are literally dozens upon dozens of these stories, and I could go on and on and on with them for hours. Lots of them in Pennsylvania, which I found interesting. For every one I found from another state, I found 3 from PA.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which I found quite interesting. And for those who don't know, we're from Pennsylvania, so those always catch my eye, quickly. It brings me to Benjamin, my son Ben. And you remember the story about the people in the tree.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know the story, when my son Ben was about 8, 9 years old, we lived in this big old house, and there was these catapala trees, which are these great big trees that they call Indian cigar trees. And they have these big wide leaves. And he had an encounter a couple times there where he said that whatever it was up in the tree came down, and it came down head first, like it crawled like a lizard, and it moved very quickly. And he thought it was dark green, but that was something that when I told him this story, he sort of stopped and he said, Mom, maybe I thought it was green because I could see through it. And I saw the leaves. And he also had talked at the time about it tapping on his bedroom window, and how that terrified him, and it would watch him. And we actually got to the place where I had to lock all the windows. I had to pull all the curtains. I had to put a blanket over it at one point. And there were no bushes, shrubs, tree branches, anything that could tap the window just to cover that point. And this is something that has scared him for a lifetime. And he had a second encounter when he was a teenager, about 17, 18 years old, about 4 miles away, up in the woods. Him and a friend were up there hiking, and they came back faster than they left. And they both had seen it. And I have to tell you that going through these and reading through these, I saw events, like things that made me think, I wonder if what he saw was one of these translucent creatures. And there are many accounts where it talks about, I could see the woods behind it. I could see the trees through it. If it was in the top of the trees and these great big leaves, and a catapoa tree, the leaves are huge and really wide. It would definitely have a greenish hue. So I don't know. I just think that when I read some of this to him as I was prepping for this podcast, he was fascinated. Not just fascinated, but he began to look at things in a slightly different way. And he's the one who said, I always thought it was tapping. Maybe it was clicking. Maybe that's what I heard. Because I was, as a kid, and I was scared to death, but I know it definitely was making a noise, and it was a rhythmic noise. So I don't know what the answers are to all of this. I only know that whatever it is, it seems to be happening all across at least the United States for sure. There are stories from Europe. There are stories from South America. I have found stories from, other places as well. Whatever it is, it's been moving along for a long, long time. We've given it different names. We've told the story in different ways. It's a ghost, it's a angel, it's an elemental, it's this, it's that. But at the end of the day, there's a specific grouping of these things that are between 5 and 8 feet tall. They are always translucent. They always give off this terrible fear. And they seem to play with humans. Now, one last point, and I'll end this particular podcast. In the 411 books, David Paulides tells a story in the one about hunters. And this is of Bruce Maccabee's wife. I believe her name's Jan Maccabee. Bruce Maccabee is he's a scientist. And he tells the story about something that happened to his wife. She was an avid hunter, had grown up in, I believe it's in Texas, and had always loved to hunt. She would bow hunt. So they had a blind on their property, and she had company coming one night, but she thought she had everything prepped and ready to go. She was going to take a couple hours and go out and try to bow hunt and see what she could come up with. She's sitting in the blind. She has her phone on, but the sound turned down because she's kind of waiting for somebody to text her and say, hey, we're on our way. And then she knows she's got to go in. And that's when she sees this thing. And it's moving. And it's that same thing, like water rippling, but it's in the shape of a human being. And it filled her with this intense terror. And she actually said that she picked up her phone and got ready to take a photo of it because she was not sure she was going to make it out of there, and she wanted Bruce to know what she saw. So she snapped one photo, threw her bow, and took off running. She gets to the house. She's hysterical. She's telling him what she saw. It's right after they released Predator on DVD for the first time. So he has a copy of it because he thought it was cool. And she had never seen it because she's not into that stuff. So he took her into the den. He put the movie on. He fast forwarded to a section where it's moving in the movie, and she freaks out. Oh my God, this is what I saw. Not the tentacles again, but that shape and that general ability to like blend into the background, that thing. He took her photograph on her cell phone and took it and had it scientifically analyzed. It is energy lines moving across the phone. There is definitely something on the picture. It is dimensional, and it is moving as a massive energy. Now, what if, in all those 411 books and all these things and all these people that just suddenly disappear, and they disappear in the most bizarre ways. You're walking along, you're 10 feet in front of your friends, and poof, you're gone, right? What if these things do take people down? What if these things do more, and we have then just make us frightened, and we have a primal fear of them because somewhere in our ancestry they were hunting us?
Possible.
It is.
And just thinking the amount of energy necessary to cloak or to visually obscure something so that you could see through it. But all right, so I know we've had our scientists have been working on ways. Well, who am I kidding? We know how to do it, all right?
Right.
But the general populace doesn't. So a way to basically bend the light around an object, but in doing so, I mean, you still have that curvature. So I mean, just like when you see the shimmering of heat coming off of a road. I mean, because that's a lot of thermal energy,
right,
and that makes that happen. So I can see that. So to generate that amount of power and to be portable, because I would think that whoever is carrying it has to have that power source with them to be able to do that. So that's,
yes,
again, extraordinarily advanced. And it falls back to, again, we think the advanced civilizations would be benevolent and kind and want to help us out, and doesn't, at least to me, that doesn't sound like that's the case.
No, and there's no one answer for what's going on, that those people are disappearing. There's none. And sometimes their bodies are found, and they're found in bizarre positions, still inside their clothing, or with their clothing neatly folded beside them, or all kinds of crazy stuff. And some of them just don't come back at all. And so there's no consensus. But what if that is one of the things that's out in those woods? What if that's one of the things that is after them? Because if the regular predators, a bear or a wolf or something like that, when they find the bodies, they're not finding that kind of stuff. If you have a child and they're killed by a predator, their clothing's going to be torn apart. There's going to be, breakage of the bones, and you're going to see the tooth marks and what have you. None of that happens.
I don't want the answer to this one.
I don't know what the answer to this is either. I just think it's a fascinating subject.
It's fascinating, but I don't want to know the answer. I don't want to meet the answer.
I don't want to meet the answer, that's for sure. I would like to know what it is so we could prep for it, but I don't even know if that would even be possible to prep for something like that is so advanced. And the idea that somewhere out there really is a predatory creature that at least enjoys playing cat and mouse with us, and then at worst, maybe taking us for trophies or food. There's hundreds of thousands of people every year that go missing. And I don't think they all go missing this way. you know, some of them disappear on their own, some of them are kidnapped and murdered, some of them are taken and put into sex trafficking. There's a whole bunch of answers, but this is maybe one of them.
Yeah.
You know me, I'm always going down a rabbit hole somewhere. And I popped up out of this rabbit hole going, I got to talk to you about this because I know you understand dimensions and that this thing, that maybe what's after us, what's here, what's coming here, maybe some of them are benevolent. Some of them that, you know, I saw stories about where I wasn't afraid of it. It looked, you know, like it was having a rough time or this or that was going on. But other ones, there's a particular class of these that seems to maybe not be benevolent.
Yeah, the first story sounded more like, yeah, well, in my mind at least, interdimensional being. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the stories you told before about like a door opens in the air and someone comes through,
Right.
you know, or something comes through. That's more in the line of what I'm thinking of. Something using a higher dimension than us. I mean, we live in three-dimensional space. I mean, so we live in X, Y, Z axes. I mean, that's where we are. And I think I told you before, after one of the episodes, that we really can't perceive something that's another dimension above us. So a
Right.
four-dimensional creature or a four-dimensional object, it would be different. So think about a two-dimensional person. So let's go all the way back to Flatland. Okay, if
Right.
you've ever read that book. So in Flatland, everything is flat. Everything's two-dimensional. Well, if a three-dimensional object appeared, it would look like a line, just like everything else.
Right.
But so let's say as a three-dimensional object, so let's say a triangle, for example, a three-dimensional object moving up into a two-dimensional space, you would see a pinpoint appear, and then it would just get wider, 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 and you wouldn't understand what was going on. Just like if we in three-dimensional space were to see, let's say, for example, a four-dimensional sphere entering our space, we would see a tiny ball, and it would get bigger, 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 bigger. But that's would be as it's moving through our three-dimensional space.
Right.
So that's that kind of thinking and stuff like that just fascinates me. But so I'm really thinking that, oh, kitty cat. I was thinking that yeah, the translucent ones. I'm not sold that they would be interdimensional. Maybe they're using interdimensional space to travel here. But once they're in our three-dimensional space, that's where they're existing. You know that. So whether their origin is someplace else, well, obviously it is. But whether it's a four-dimensional space, five, whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking once they enter our space, though, then they do fall under most of our rules.
It's an interesting concept, isn't it?
Quite.
So some other night we will come and visit this subject again as I keep going, because like I said, I have dozens of stories that I probably, my notes were somewhere near 130 pages of notes for this episode, because I just kept finding great stories and going, oh, I can't let that go.
All right. So if you, our viewers and listeners, have enjoyed Patty's stories, please do us the favor of clicking the like button, whether it be in Facebook or YouTube or whatever. That lets the algorithm know that you enjoy our content and that you will be suggested more of that type of content in the future, especially on YouTube. That's how their algorithm works. If you haven't subscribed to us, please subscribe. Click the bell so that you'll be notified when we release new content. You can get to us through, you can go directly to YouTube, the Paranormalist Podcast, or you can just go in your web browser, theparanormalistpodcast.com. That will redirect you to our, I can't remember if I made it, I think it's to the YouTube channel. That's where that goes. Yeah. And then the Facebook page, the same name, the Paranormalist Podcast, and the email address, the email address is simply just paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. I know there's a lot of letters to type in, so to make it easier for you, in the description down below, it'll be there. You can just copy and paste or click on the link as it is. So we really appreciate everybody watching and listening. We appreciate all of our subscribers. The Facebook group has well shot past the 500 mark, which was
Yes.
fantastic. So we're really happy to have all of you with us there. And with that, I think all my message of the technology stuff is over.
So everybody have a good evening, and thank you for listening. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Patty. Good night.
Good night.